All right. Well, welcome back to another episode of California Unfiltered. Want to say thank you for joining us again. And before we even get to it, please please subscribe. We're doing high-level policy discussions here. We're talking about things that you won't find in the mainstream news. We're providing analysis that can't be found anywhere else. While it is focused on California politics, it also has a view to the larger American states. We are today going to discuss some very interesting topics. Now, the first one is going to be a series of polls on the amount of division in America. How divided do Americans actually think America is? We're going to be looking at 3 different polls. I was able to interview one of the pollsters directly on my own channel, Marcus Ruiz Evans. You can check that out. I'll have a little bit of notes on that. And then we're going to go into why California voters are upset that the Democratic Party isn't upset enough. A lot of California voters and liberal voters are upset that the Democratic Party doesn't seem to match their level of anger at the Republican takeover America. What does that mean? We'll get right to that in just a second. Okay, well, here we're going to start our first segment. Now, this is on division in America, a topic that I've covered for about a decade. You had ideas that there was a division in America. You didn't really see, I would say, solid evidence of a division in America until the rise of Trump in 2016. Of course, there was the University of Virginia Sabato Crystal Ball Center that did a survey slightly after Trump's, I think, first term or during that, and that showed about 78% of Democrats and 82% of Republicans viewed all voters on the other side as an existential threat to America, language typically reserved for an ISIS terrorist attack or a Russian nuclear strike on the D.C. Capitol. Americans felt that that level of danger, that level of existential threat to the America that they know, was comprised by about 80% of all of the other voters. So 80% of Republicans felt that 80% of the Democrats were like that, and about 80% of the Democrats felt like 80% of the Republicans were like that. So pretty bad. That was a couple years ago. I haven't seen any recent polling since then until relatively recently. So we're going to cover that right now. And here are those 3 polls. So the first one we're going to talk about, and we're going to go in order. So the first one I want to point out is September 23rd, 2024. That is, Americans agree nation is divided on key values. Percentage perceiving nation is divided ticks up to new high. That is by Jeffrey M. Jones for the Gallup poll. The Gallup poll is one of the most respected polls in America out there, period. So they looked at this last year in September. So last year, right before Christmas, is when they were looking at this. And here's what they had. Quote, a record high 80% of U.S. adults believe Americans are greatly divided on the most important values, end quote. Quote, only 18% believe the country is united. They're speaking about values. The percentage seeing the nation as divided has ticked up from 77% the last time Gallup asked the question in 2016. So in 2016, like we were talking about when Trump was there, that's when you started to see division. So they're mentioning that in 2016 with Trump, you saw 77% of Americans say that the country is divided. It's now 8 years later, right? So that poll was taken in 2016. Now we fast forward to 2024, and Gallup is saying it used to be 77% in 2016, and now it's grown to 80%. So as divisive as the rise of Trump was, as shocking as it was to the liberal mind in California, as divisive as it became, it's actually gotten worse. So as divisive and shocking as Trump has come, it's actually ticked up a few points more. Not a whole lot, 77 to 80%, but it has grown. The division's actually grown since the initial introduction of Trump. Okay, so that's September 23rd, 2024. Okay. So I'm going to write that down, September 23rd, 2024. Now, the next poll is March 7th, 2025. Okay, so we're going right before Christmas last year, and then now we're coming up to now, which is basically spring of the new year. So right before Christmas, you just heard, now we're going to go to spring of this year. So these polls are really only separated by about half a year. It's worth the time. They're in separate years, but really we're only talking about 5 or 6 months difference between them-ish. The name of this poll is, was last Tuesday night a major turning point, by John Zogby Strategies, published on March 7th, 2025. This is on their YouTube channel. I recommend everybody watch that. 78% of Democrats and 65% of independents say America is drifting apart. 78% of Democrats and 65% of independents say America is drifting apart. So basically 2/3 of all progressives, no matter how you, moderate progressives to hardcore progressives, all say America's falling apart. So that's what they said. Overall, 60% of Americans say America's drifting apart. So 60% of all America says America's drifting apart. 4/5 of all Democrats say it's drifting apart, right? Now that's spring. This is only about 4, 5, 6 months from the poll I just told you about with Gallup. Now we're going to fast forward to, and by the way, if you want to know more about that poll, 78% of Democrats and 65% of independents say America's drifting apart, you can go to Marcus Ruiz Evans. I did a one-on-one interview with Jeremy Zogby, who conducted the poll, and we do more of a deep dive there. The next poll I want to show you is called Poll. American voters are deeply divided on DEI programs and political correctness. This is by Bridget Bowman for NBC News on March 18th, 2025. Also this month, also springtime. Half of registered voters, 49% in the NBC News poll, say DEI programs should be eliminated. And 48% say DEI programs in the workplace should continue. It's literally a dead tie. There's no indication of any form of unified opinion on this issue. Basically, half of America says they're against DEI, and literally half of America says they're for it. That's as divided as you can get, 50-50. There's nothing even approaching that. And then I showed you how a little bit before that, they were showing 60% of Americans say the country's drifting apart, including the majority of Democrats. And then we can go back to right before Christmas of last year, where it showed 80% of Americans believe they're greatly divided on issues. 80% of Americans say they're greatly divided on issues. They said that September 2024. Now you fast forward to March 2025, and Americans are as divided on values as they possibly could be when we're looking at DEI programs, which is one of the most controversial topics out there. So what it basically shows is that if you go back to the University of Virginia Sabato Crystal Ball survey poll that compared Biden voters to Trump voters, and it showed about 78 and 82% of all members of that party viewed about that percentage of everyone in the other party as an existential threat. That poll came out at least 4 or 5 years ago. It doesn't appear that things are better at all. It appears that actually the amount of Americans who are pessimistic about the future of America has actually ticked up some. It is now a solid majority of liberals and progressives think that a country is falling apart. And we have, as close as we possibly get to a dead heat on how America should handle a particular value issue. All of this says lack of unity, no ability to Congress towards a unified opinion as a body politic. Basically, the people can't come together and have a unified opinion on anything. And if you're looking at the University of Virginia poll 4 or 5 years ago, and you're looking up to this now, we're looking at about a half-decade period of continuously bad polling showing things are divided and no one's coming together. My question at that point is, how long can you have division before the possibility of reunifying is gone? So let's say you and I are married. We have a separation for a week. Highly likely we could come back together. What happens if we have a separation for 6 months? A year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. the chances of coming back into that marriage and making that relationship work expand exponentially based upon time. So if you travel back to 2016 and you're seeing these divisive polls, there's a chance to fix it. But now we're looking at polls from 2016 to about 2020 to now 2024, and it looks like a 5 to 7 year period of continually horrible polls. We're at the debatable point where you can't fix it and you can't put Humpty Dumpty's men back together again, simply because it's been too divided for too long. Have you ever heard too little, too late? That's the phrase. When a problem has become so exacerbated and so ballooned in size, and it has been let to fester for so long that it's basically unfixable. Too little, too late. Well, the reverse of that phrase is too much, too quick. And that's where we are here in America. That's the polling. That's not my opinion. Those are hard polls from the best pollsters in America telling you that everybody thinks the country's falling apart. Okay, moving on to the next subject. Now, this is kind of interesting because I want to read you this. So here we go. What's happening now is it looks like Democrats are having a tough time because they're having to explain the realities of the American political system to the American voters, and they don't want to hear it. And so basically what's happening is you're seeing articles like this. Democrat governors balance whether to fight or pacify after Trump threatens one of their own, by Joey Campoletti for the Associated Press on February 23rd, 2025. Basically what they're talking about is President Donald Trump of America got into an argument with the governor of Maine. And he said, you better back down on the transgender sports programs, to which the governor said, we will follow the law and I'll see you in court. That, if you watch the video, enraged Trump. I don't think he was expecting to be challenged because his voice tone changed. He was like, you better get rid of the transgender things. He goes, see you in court. And he goes, see you in court. See you in court. Like you could see him literally tick. It literally explode right on the mic. It was very visible. He started losing it. And he's like, you better do this or I'm going to get you and I'm going to do that and I'm going to do this to you. And it was very 1930s dictator. So if you watch a lot of black and white movies of early dictators like Mussolini, Hitler, Franco, some of these other guys, they were very big on I'm in charge. I'm basically a king again. Dictators were a form of return to kingship and monarchy. So Europe had all these kingships. They got rid of them somewhere around the 1800s, 1830. There was a major fall of a bunch of them. Around the 1920s and the 1930s, they were starting to consider this idea that maybe that wasn't the best. That maybe you did need kind of a strong man leader who just made the rules, like the kings used to be back in the day. And so they kind of looked to that in Germany and Spain and multiple other countries. In fact, in America, I'm just going to leave it at the plot to overthrow FDR with former Marine General Smedley Butler. Looked that up in 1933. It was a supposedly plot to overthrow FDR and put in a strongman dictator like they had in Italy, Spain, and Germany. Anyways, it didn't happen. I don't know if it's real. It's a story out there. But can we turn that down just a little? Yeah. So when we're looking at this, when you watch Trump's reaction to Governor Janet Mills of Maine, it's very normal. And then the moment she says, see you in court, he changes. His tone changes. He becomes flustered. And then he starts issuing out a bunch of threats. So basically, what Trump's done is he started cutting off federal money from every single federal program to Maine that he can, whether it's applicable or not. So all sorts of things like ag programs and education programs, cut. He even had the Social Security administrator cut people off from registering for Social Security. And then he had to walk that back and say maybe that was a mistake. But then they asked, well, why you did it? And he goes, I was personally upset with them. So the guy who cut Social Security said, I did it for emotional reasons. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's not just liberal news. He actually admitted that. So we're there now. I'm upset with you, so I punish you with the government. That guy said it. He's not in trouble at all. Secondly, this assumes that Donald Trump doesn't operate that way himself. If you watch the Breaking Points episode by crystal ball and Sagar and Jetty on Trump and the Maine governor, you'll see both of them talk about that, and that how it's a true break of norms for a president to say, you know, I don't know if I really want to help because I don't really like you guys, or I don't really like your policies, or you vote wrong, or you vote differently. So I'm not sure I'm going to help you out in a disaster. Crystal and Sagar both admitted that what Trump's doing is a solid break from the past. Now, have politicians politicized the federal government? Sure. The Tea Party famously accused Barack Obama of directing the IRS to punish them. There's some evidence of that. But even then, it was hard to prove, and it was smoke and mirrors, and nobody would admit it. And it maybe happened, maybe didn't. Trump said straight up, I'm going to do it, and then he did it. That's never happened before in American history. That's what Crystal and Sagar were pointing out. That is a total break from norms. You've never seen that. Now, if you've watched us here on the channel, you've heard us say, I have a test for people. And I tell them, when the Palisades fire happened in California and Californians were burned alive and dead on the ground, not in a cemetery, not taking, their corpses are there. They're all homeless. They're destitute. They're crying. They're in shock, most that they've ever had in their life. And Trump says, I don't know if I want to help, because I don't really like you guys. And the Speaker Johnson says the same thing. That was disgusting and horrible and had never happened before in American history. I'd been saying that. Now, finally, Sagar and Crystal are breaking points when they're talking about the Maine governor and Trump, the issue we just talked about, basically admitted that same thing in that show. So what that gets to is this. Democrats are having a hard time explaining to voters that Americans live in what's called a federal system of government. And they're trying to explain to people that they really can't do a lot to stand up against Trump, no matter how much you're upset with him, because the Republicans own the House, the Senate, the presidency, and the Supreme Court. And you have to go back to 1920s, or about 100 years in the past, for the first time that the Republican Party has had this much power. By the way, someone pointed out to me, last time the Republicans had that much power, they caused the Great Depression. That's a historical fact. So just putting that out there. They wanted to deregulate everything. So you had the roaring 20s, and then you had the crash in the 30s. That is all because of Republican fiscal policy. So last time the Republicans had this much power at the federal level, they literally crashed the entire global economy and put Americans in such destitution that they, I think there was about a 5-year period where Americans just froze to death in the streets. We don't really talk about that, but people literally couldn't be fed, and they would freeze to death on Main Street in many American towns. Children, mothers holding their children, would just die of starvation and freeze. Like in a third world country with no functional government. That's how America was during the Great Depression, caused by Republicans with their deregulation plan. And now they're back. And it's the first time that they're back, they've had that much power. So here's one article from, let's see here, the Associated Press. Yeah, I covered it. Democratic governors balance whether to fight or pacify after Trump threatens one of their own. I explained a little bit about that. The key quote from there is from this Democrat voter. We are beyond angry, and we are organizing against Democrats that sell us out. They're asking, why can't the Democrats be as upset as the Republicans as we are? Let me show you another example. So this is from I Wish You'd Be Angry. California Democrats face voter fury over Trump and Elon Musk in the Los Angeles Times by reporter Laura J. Nelson on March 20th, 2025. Let me read you a few quotes. Quote, I just wish that the Democrats would match my anger and fear, she concluded. The packed room burst into applause. That's from a Democratic voter. Quote, in California's deep blue districts, town hall meetings have become venting sessions for voters fed up with Trump, Musk, and the weakness of the Democratic Party. Not my words, Los Angeles Times. Lawmakers have tried to walk the line between showing their own anger and explaining that with Republicans controlling the House, the Senate, the White House, there's, quote, only so much they can do. Remind me, I need to bring up Hakeem Jeffries. Another quote, in the House of Representatives, the majority is in complete control, Cisneros said, Democratic legislator, as the crowd in El Monte muttered in displeasure. That's here in California. We cannot take a bill to the floor to get voted on because we are in the minority. The only one who makes the decision is the Speaker of the House. Anything we do, he's not going to move it forward, said Cisneros. Another quote, one CNN poll conducted early March found that 29% of Americans had a favorable view of the Democratic Party, down from 33% in January. So the Democrats are not doing very well right now. Another quote, during a new episode of Gavin Newsom's podcast that aired Tuesday, Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, that was the person who ran with Kamala Harris as the Democratic choice for vice president, said the reason the popularity of Democrats is plummeting is because of the loss of confidence among members of their own party. The Democratic Party is unified. They're unified in being pissed off at the Democrats, Walz said. And he added, they are unified that Donald Trump's policies are going to hurt people. Quote, Cisneros said he'd spoken against Musk and the Department of Governmental Efficiency from the floor of the House. In one speech, he described Musk's efforts as a coup. And he said he had joined the Democrats who heckled Trump during the president's joint address to Congress. Part of the problem, he said, is that some constituents weren't hearing about what the Democrats were doing. And others were, but they felt didn't go far enough. It's tough, right, says Cisneros, whose district includes West Covina, El Monte, Baldwin Park, and Glendora. That's in Southern California. People want the action, but when they see this action, they're like, well, that's not enough. So the Los Angeles Times article from March 20th, 2025, and the Associated Press article from February 23rd, 2025. So this is basically end of February to mid-March. They're saying the same things. A lot of Democratic voters are massively upset at the Democratic Party. They want the Democratic Party to yell and scream and fight and kick just like they did in 2016. The problem is they don't have the majority in Congress to do any of what they tried in 2016. And it looks like something I've said. A lot of American voters don't understand the government and they don't understand federalism. So Democrats are now having to explain to them, the reason it looks like we're not doing much is because we're not going to go and mount an opposition to what the Republicans do just to get shut down automatically because we don't have the votes in the House, the Senate, the presidency, or the Supreme Court. We'll basically get shut down on everything we try, and we're just going to look silly and stupid for trying to push legislation up or combat legislation, knowing we have no chance in hell. So our opinion is we should do nothing unless it looks right. I want to bring up Hakeem Jeffries. We talked about it here on the show. Hakeem Jeffries, leader of the Democratic Party, said, we will fight where it looks like we strategically could win, meaning we're not going to take the fight everywhere. We're not going to fight everything. We're going to fight where we win, AKA they're saying the same thing. It's a nice way of putting, we may not do a whole lot because we can't. We're not going to do symbolic actions of protesting the president or trying to combat legislation when we're just going to get shot down every time. It's demoralizing, and we don't want to look stupid as a party. So although you, the people of America who are progressive, want us to fight and be more angry with Trump, we've basically said we're outclassed. There's nothing we can do in the federal system, and we're going to take a break and not really do anything until he gets there. But hey, we're going to hold up signs when he's giving a speech saying we're not happy with him, and we'll shake a cane at him. And I'll as a politician, I'll give some really nasty tongue lashing to Trump in the media. But if you're looking for actual governance, actual politicians doing something that matters in Congress to push back at Trump, you're basically saying two articles saying Democratic voters are of the opinion that the Democratic Party isn't doing it, and the amount they're doing is just way too little. They're basically not in the fight, and people are now upset with them for not being in the fight. What a tough position for the Democrats to be in, because a lot of liberals think Trump's an illegitimate president. He was convicted of crimes. Therefore, he can't be president. Therefore, we don't have to listen to him. That's not how the law works. So they don't care. They have this opinion of what's moral and right. And he shouldn't be president, and he committed an insurrection, and he broke the law, and he did all these horrible things, so he just shouldn't be president. A lot of Democratic voters are struggling to understand that that's not how the system works, period. Should it? Sure. Has it ever worked that way? Not one day in the last 200 years. There's a system called federalism. And what it says is whoever has the power at the federal level trumps anybody else below that level. So if you're a liberal state like California or Maine, you lose every single time. There's no way around that. There's no way around that. Federal law supersedes state law. State law supersedes county and local law. Period. End of story. There's no basis for any other interpretation of the law, which means as long as Republicans basically dominate the federal level, they can push through anything they want, and there's literally nothing that liberals can do to stop it at all. Nothing. You used to have the courts have your back because you could get some justices in, and they'd been there for a while, but Donald Trump has turned the Supreme Court the most conservative it's been in 90 years, according to NPR. Remember how I was saying Republicans were in control in the 20s? We're going back to the level of conservatism the Supreme Court had in the 1920s. This court in 2025 is more in line with the 1920s court than anything else. So when you're talking about, oh, the courts will protect us like they did in the past, based on what? The Supreme Court, again, trumps all other courts. That's the way that it works. So it doesn't matter if some district, Ninth Circuit federal judge says, Trump, you can't cut off fundings. The Supreme Court could come back and just say, yeah, we can. And here's the other thing Americans don't get. They don't really have to have solid legal reasoning to make the decisions. It's called a precedent change. Supreme Court can do this anytime they want. So let's go back to the 1800s. There was a court case called Dred Scott, where the Supreme Court said the Constitution permits slavery, which it did. And so therefore, Dred Scott's a slave and he can't do anything about it. Later on, the court said, that's horrible. We can't have slaves. And they just decided slavery's bad. There was no legal basis for that. They just decided that although the Constitution allowed for slavery, they just weren't going to do that anymore. If you look at the women's abortion decision, there was some quick thinking with that too. If you look at the Obergefell decision, which allowed gay marriage, there was some quick thinking with that too. The point is the Supreme Court can just overturn precedent at will and nobody can do anything about it. And it's not like they change precedent and somebody can go, well, I don't think your legal reasoning was strong enough, so we can, make you, Supreme Court, rethink this decision. That's not the way it works at all. They can cite whatever they want and use whatever legal reasons they want, and that's the law, period. There's nothing you can do about it unless you can get all of Congress to pass a law. That's the only way to get around the Supreme Court. How are you going to do that when the Republicans run everything? So I think what's happened is that the Democrats have told people since 2016, about 10 years, Trump's bad and evil and wrong. Therefore, we're right. Maybe that's true. Maybe it's not true at all. It's completely irrelevant because that's not how the system works. I remember in 2016 when Donald Trump won the election, nobody in California believed it. Everybody in California thought he got 25% of the vote and Russia rigged the whole thing and put him in. There was no real evidence at that time. He had a lot of support at that time. Californians were just not going to accept that half the country voted for this guy. So they basically willfully denied it for the next 4 years. It's been completely disproven now. You can look at the Durham report. But if you talk to most Californians, they don't know what the Durham report is. And they'll say, I think it was proven that Trump was in by Russia. No evidence there, completely debunked. And there wasn't really solid evidence at the time. Liberals lived in their own bubble. They had an image of America. Reality be damned. I know it looks like he won the election. He must not have. You can fast forward to now 2024. I can't tell you the number of liberals who have told me that Elon Musk rigged the whole election, hacked into federal voting systems, changed votes. Nobody in the federal government noticed or said anything, and that's how Trump won. That's literally what Trump said in 2020. The federal government rigged the election so that he would lose. Now I can't tell you the number of liberals who are saying the literal same thing Republicans were saying in 2020, just shoes on the other foot. Now it's 2024. Trump's not the legitimate president. A majority did not vote for him because Musk rid the whole thing. This is the second election where Trump was picked by the American people, and liberals in California cannot accept that. They just won't do it. Something else happened to make that not the reality when all the evidence shows that. I don't like Trump. I hate him. He said Mexicans are rapists. I'll argue with anybody about that. I think he's an existential threat. But I also recognize he won the election in 2016 and 2024, and he almost won in 2020. Biden won by 2 percentage points. That's not a clubbing. That's not a bludgeoning of Trump at all. So there seems to be a disconnect between I don't like Trump and can I accept the reality on the ground versus I don't like Trump and I want to live in my own reality bubble. And I think what's happening is you're actually seeing where the rubber meets the road. The Democrats have been playing this game for so long because it had them win election, win election, win election. If you look at Kamala's election campaign, it was all Trump's horrible, vote for me. If you look at what the Democrats did in 2018, it was Trump's horrible, vote for me. 2020, 2022, 2024, Trump's horrible, vote for me. They've been doing that. In fact, you saw like CNN and MSNBC commentators go, maybe part of the reason Kamala didn't do so well is you didn't actually push policies. She famously didn't have policies during her thing. I mean, they tried to act like she did, but she didn't. They just pushed Trump bad. He's horrible. Let's move on. What if, in order to win elections and keep the party unified, they, let's say unintentionally, misinformed half of the American population? And they made them think that if you're on the moral right side and you clearly see this as wrong, that therefore that's reality. Because what I'm seeing in these articles is elected officials having to explain basic 8th grade civics to voters. I want to repeat that. What I see when I look in these articles is elected officials having to repeat junior high school class civics to voters. They're having to let them know there's a thing called the federal system, and then underneath that state, and underneath that's local. And there's 4 branches. Well, there's 3 branches, executive, congressional, judicial, right? And, there's 2 houses. So, House, Senate, Presidency, Supreme Court. These are the organs that control power. And when you have that, you have total control. And the federal system trumps everything. I don't think liberals get that. I think Democrats don't want to make them understand that, because what a depressing message is that? We're screwed. We can't do anything. We're totally, completely politically impotent. Bury your head in the sand. They don't want to say that. So what they're going to say is, we'll fight where we can fight. We're going to resist Trump when we can. We're going to fight back at every turn that seems politically expedient. That's what I see. They don't want to explain this is how America works. You're screwed. They want everybody to think we're the moral majority, so we need to be in power and you should just support us. And that's what they ran on the last 8 years. And I think people are starting to get the hangover from the 8-year-long binge fest. They've been drinking this Trump bad, that's good enough Kool-Aid. And I think for the first time, they've had Saturday morning and woke up. And they're not feeling very well and they got a headache. And they go, why do I feel so horrible? Why can't I walk straight? You've been drinking that Kool-Aid for 8 years. You denied reality. Now reality's catching up. And what we're seeing is not reasonable discussion of voters with their elected progressive officials, but yelling and screaming in anger. This is not the America I want. I'm yelling and I'm mad. This is the way America's always been. I think your politicians didn't explain that to you, and they didn't want to run on explaining anything to you in the last 8 years because it was politically expedient to say Trump bad, vote for us. That worked. Now people are going, what exactly did that get us? And I think they're finally coming to the realization that they've been drunk the last 8 years and they have a massive hangover and they've trashed their house and there's bottles everywhere and they have no more money in their pocket. And they're starting to go, well, who fed us Kool-Aid for 8 years? And who never told us there'd be a hangover? And who never told us that alcohol was so expensive and we'd lose half our wallet? The roosters have come home to roost is another phrase. So what does all this mean? When you look at the surveys, a majority of Democrats think America's falling apart. A majority of independents think America's falling apart. A majority of Americans think there's no division, no unity on values. And what do we see now? Democrats are freaking out that their party, Democratic voters are freaking out that the Democrats can't just push through legislation that they think is important. And they don't know why, so they're acting with anger. That's the division. We don't need to work with Republicans. They're horrible and nasty and wrong, and Russia put them in, or some foreign government, or Elon Musk. So we have the moral majority, and we should just be able to ram through what we think is important. I think that's the way that the voters have been trained and programmed to think, and I think reality is crashing right into that head on. So you have people in majorities. Remember, 59% of Americans said the country's going into disunity. 4/5 of all Democrats said that. And now we're seeing Democrats exploding in rage at Democratic elected officials, which you typically don't see. Rage, anger, frustration, rage, anger, yelling, screaming, and a majority of people saying the country's falling apart. Where do you think that goes? To a good place? Kind of things that you see right before Civil War. I'm not making that up. You can look at Bosnia. You can look at Spain. You can look at Fiji. You can look at, the Civil War here in America in the 1860s. One of my favorite stories about the Civil War is I was interviewing a Texas independence guy, and he goes, only about, I think, 300 people died in Bleeding, Kansas. Bleeding, Kansas was a place in the West where Southerners and Northerners were shooting each other in the face. Like, you'd literally walk out of your house and a Southerner would walk up and shoot you in the face right in front of your kids. I'm not making this up. This is what happened. It was because Northerners wanted the territory and Southerners were afraid if the Northerners got the territory, they'd lose slavery. So they started sending all their most extremists to this Kansas place, which was the extent of the American population at that time. And it was just wild. It was like the Troubles in Ireland in the 1970s. People would be sitting down to dinner. Somebody would walk up to their window and start gunning down the whole family. They didn't even know them. They were just angry. You're a Southerner. You're a Northerner. Screw you. Die. Americans read about that for about 5 to 7 years before the Civil War ever happened. They didn't just go from, I'm mad at the South, let's start shooting. They read newspaper reports of Southerners gunning down Northerners in cold blood and shooting them in the forehead in front of their kids. And Southerners read newspaper reports for 5 to 7 years of Northerners victimizing women, shooting moms in front of their daughters. So they heard these horrible atrocity stories for 5 to 7 years. And then they had the Battle of Bull Run. It wasn't, we're upset, war. It was, we're upset, years of preparation and horror stories and anger and preparation and more horror stories until they get ramped up to some high level of anger that you're willing to have two formal armies kill each other. That's what happened in the Civil War. So what happens when we see people who are angry now, yelling and screaming at their legislators now, living in terror about their elected officials now? What happens when, as I've talked to people, you're now in your 12th to 14th year of living in fear of the next election? I'm old enough to know you used to have elections and someone would lose and you would be really upset. And you'd be like, boy, these policies are going to hurt me. But that would be it. People are terrified now. What stable country does that happen where you're literally running down your leg terrified of who's going to win every 2 years? That's not any form of stable democracy anywhere in the Western order. And yet that's the reality that Americans have been living with for the better part of a decade. Massive surveys showing division over this last 6 months, massive amounts of anger without understanding. And the Democrats saying basically we're going to do nothing to fight back. Hakeem Jeffries, Cisneros, these other articles we read. The people elected in the Democratic Party know what's up. They know what federalism is. I think they just don't want to tell people. It's depressing to hear sometimes you lose and you get absolutely nothing and you're screwed. In Japan and most of the world, they call the democratic system here in America the American winner-take-all style of democracy. It's basically not the way that democracy works in 95% of the other Western orders. They have what they call a multi-party system where you have 3 to 5 parties and you have to have a coalition government of 2 or 3 parties come together. So you always have a governing coalition of about 65, 70% of the politicians so that you can basically push legislation through. America for the last 20 years has had governing coalitions of about 49%, maybe 51%. So it's always polarized, it's always divided, and that goes back 2 decades. Most of the world doesn't operate this way at all. And when America invaded Iraq and Afghanistan to show them how to operate democracies, they did not install the American system of democracy. They installed the system most of the rest of the planet uses, a multi-party democratic coalition government system. So why does 95% of the Western world not use the American system? And why did America invade countries to teach them how to be Democrat and not force its own system of government? And why are Democratic voters losing it now and unable to have rational conversations without yelling and screaming? And why is it that division has only ticked up in poll after poll after poll over the last 5 years? That's something for you to think about. All these things are connected. And we'll continue to talk about that as time goes on. But hint, hint, it's not going to go to a good place. These are all bad signs. We'll leave it there. Now, for our final section, I wanted to show a little bit of my book here. This is California's Next Century 2.0. This came out in 2012. This is the book that actually started the California secession movement. Tom Elias, the reporter, wrote a book report about this article in LA Daily News called How Would California Do on Its Own? That was the first time a serious reporter in a serious newspaper talked about a serious book thought on California independence, basically the birth of the movement. Now, one of the 2 things I wanted to point out was some of the predictions we made back then. The first one was that First one is that California independence is not something to be worried about. This is not something that can expand. Quote, it's limited only to nations that have had governments before joining the Union, were taken militarily against their force, and are able to be effective governments and not immediately moved into a situation of economic despair. I was talking about California basically on its own. So California was an independent country from 1835 to 1846, just like Texas. Most Californians don't know that. The Californians who lived here at the time were called Californios. They pushed out 2 separate governors who were directed by Mexico to run the territory. Under international law, that means de facto independence. Kevin Smith, there's a famous California historian, Kevin something, drawing a blank. And he basically wrote that down in his book of California. California was independent from America and Mexico for about 10 years. So I was saying that, there isn't many places in America that had an independent government before they joined America. California, Texas, and Vermont, I think, are the only exceptions. Maybe Hawaii. And they were taken by military force against that will. That's limited now to Hawaii and California. And they have to be able to be effective governments and not in economic despair on their own. Kevin Starr is the name of the historian. No one questions anything Kevin Starr says on California history. And so I was pointing out that there's very few places that can actually meet these conditions that California meets in order to become independent. So when we're talking about California independence and people will say that leads to the dissolution of America, I've always said, based on what? 45 states would be Central African Republic poor the moment they went independent. Straight up. You can look up what's called a GDP of states compared to nations map, and it'll show you the economic level different states would be if they were independent. Most of them are like the Congo, Swaziland, somewhere in there. So I said, if you look at it from economics, only New York City, Texas, and California could leave. And if you look at it from being a formal government before and being able to stand on your own and being taken wrongfully, the list even gets small too. So I've always said it's just kind of a California thing. Now, here's the other thing we said. If California is allowed to devolve, then what is to stop California counties from wanting to devolve further? The answer is twofold. It is already widely recognized in California that counties have too much independent power. And this helped cause the routine political confusion in Sacramento. There's also been about 220 campaigns to split California into different regions since the gold rush, and all of them have failed. Furthermore, California sociologists who study California said we're more likely to exist in 7 to 12 distinct regions, not 52 separate counties. That really doesn't have any backing when you look at people who study the state. So the other thing that we've talked about with CALEXIT is people said, well, what about the Jefferson movement? I was doing an interview with a podcast, and they were asking about that. And I said, the Jefferson movement can't go anywhere unless the people of California allow them to leave. That's the way the law works. So they can talk about how they love Trump and how they hate California and they're not treated fairly. Means nothing. They can't go anywhere, and they can't leave California unless a majority of Californians say they can go, and that's in the American Constitution. So I was pointing out in 2012 how when we're talking about California independence, it's really limited to California and maybe one or two other places. And when we're talking about California independence, it can't actually devolve. It's not going to go into more breaks and more breaks and breaks because of basically the way the law works. Those two data points are still true today. So we figured that out in 2012, still relevant in 2024. We made the predictions that CALEXIT or secession talk would really only be strongly applied to very few places. That's still playing out. Right now, I think it's Alaska, Texas, and California. And we also made the point that California independence would not lead to the dissolution and atomization of California. And that's still the case. So we'll have more predictions in the future from the book that started it all. But at this moment, we're going to end the show. It's about an hour in. We try to keep it tight, concise as best as we can. I hope you found it informative. This is all hard data points. I know that it's a little bit depressing to hear about these things. They don't exactly sound like good news, but if you're coming at it from the California independence standpoint, this is fantastic news. It's sad to hear, but it means we're closer than ever to achieving that goal. We'll leave it there. Before you go, remember to like and subscribe. We want to get this information out to more people. We're providing unique insights, information, data you can't find anywhere else. Help us help out other Californians. Thank you. We'll see you next time. Finally, I have a special message. I need to say to Californians, we cannot let this happen again. CALEXIT is the only answer to the takeover of MAGA and the conservatives. Americans, if you're listening, now is the time to move to California before California becomes its own country. Please listen to my words well. We'll see you soon. Thank you.